called analytical idealism, then I take him seriously. Sold a couple days ago, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Bernardo Kastrup, who holds 2 PhDs, one in computer science and the other in philosophy. He also has a host of accolades. So for example, he's worked at CERN. He's also sold a fairly large company to IBM. When someone like that comes along and suggests that all we experience, all that we see, all that is traditional physical matter is actually taking place within the mind, and that we're all part of one mind, that is a particular philosophical doctrine called analytical idealism, then I take him seriously. And I'm glad that I did, because I had one of the best, if not the best, conversations that I've ever had, let alone on this podcast. We were scheduled to talk for approximately 2 hours, and we ended up going for almost 5. The timestamps, as usual, are in the description, so feel free to skip ahead to whichever section you like. And I wanted to put a special thank you out there to my Patreon supporters. I do this with almost all my time, so the small amount or the large amount that you give helps me tremendously. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the podcast. Well, I want you to know that I admire you. I've watched your work for the past maybe 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks straight, just inputting you into my brain. And I think you're the most articulate and coherent, not only of those who are idealists, but of those who oppose materialism and physicalism in general.
Thank you, sir.
When I get to the questions about mind at large, I do have questions about, well, given that mind at large, or mind itself, is naturally deceptive, well, how do we discern what's true from what's not? So we'll get to that later. I think as a great overview for the audience, instead of explicitly talking about what your views are, why don't you talk about how you came upon your views? Because most of the people who oppose materialism or physicalism, I find they are raised in a Vedic tradition or a Buddhist tradition or a Hindu tradition, and they already have a predisposition to wanting consciousness to be one and united with all. But yours isn't this a priori conclusion where you then looked at the data and tried to fit it to what you believe. I think that's interesting. I think that you need to tell the audience about where you started and where you got to, and in there, talk about your theories.
So I've always been a philosopher in the sense that I've always asked the big questions. What is this? What is the world? What is life? What is this strange condition of being alive and having to eat and breathe to fight entropy? I mean, this has always interested me. And then I very early went to computer engineering school. I had just turned 17. Because I was fascinated by computers and artificial intelligence since very early. And then 5 years of that, and you have very little time to ask philosophical questions when you're doing computer engineering. It's a lot to absorb. But later on, already I was in my late 20s. I had already gotten my first PhD, and I was
precisely what was your
computer processor architectures, reconfigurable computing. Which is processors that can rewire themselves during program execution, which was all the rave in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now it's sort of incorporated into commercial processors, but at the time it was very innovative. And then I was already in the early days of my professional life, first few years, and AI continued to be a big interest of mine. I was even as a hobby, I was at home thinking about, how do you get a processor not only to be intelligent, but to be sentient? And of course, I had hidden materialist assumptions behind that question, because I thought of consciousness, of sentience, as something that you create, that you bring about, that you bring into being. And I was cracking my head about, how to make a computer sentient. And I was reading the work of people like that Finnish guy that used to work at Monte Research. I forgot his name. He wrote a book called Conscious Machines. Pentti Haikanen, his name, Pentti Haikanen. And he had what to me at the time was the most compelling articulation of how to create artificial sentience at the time. But at some point I realized that this was an egg I couldn't crack, because I was starting from wrong assumptions. And I had this insight after reading a paper by David Chalmers in which he discussed the hard problem of consciousness. He didn't solve it, he just framed it, and framing a problem well is half the solution. because it makes you alert to the issues that you had been ignoring before. And when I read the statement of the problem, it clicked. I thought, I'm coming about it from a completely arbitrary direction. I'm making arbitrary assumptions. Consciousness is not something you create, it's that within which every creation happens, including the creation of a computer. And I am conflating artificial intelligence with artificial sentience. These are completely different things, and we have a lot of reasons to think that one of them will be successful, namely strong AI, but we have absolutely no reason to think that we can create an artificially conscious being, any more reason than we have to think that by simulating kidney function on my computer, the computer will urinate on my desk. And that for me was sort of the trigger to rethink everything, to examine every hidden assumption I had ever made, to sort of completely refurbish my worldview along more reasonable, explicit, coherent lines. And it was quite an enterprise. But ultimately I came to answers that were quite satisfying to me in the sense that I couldn't shoot them down. I couldn't shoot down my own answers after a few years. And I was only glad to realize that, hey, the sages of the Indus Valley 3,500 years ago had come to the same answers. And so did people in the Western tradition. Plato, Schopenhauer, to mention too, Jung. And that surely gave reassurance, but I came to my views based on my own painful process of reasoning, looking at the evidence, examining my own assumptions, and parting with those that were incoherent and illogical, even if they were aligned with the assumptions and views that I inherited from my culture.
So what are your conclusions? Why don't you state the metaphysical assumptions of materialism and how they compare and contrast with yours?
Okay, for a materialist, there is experience, but it's created inside our brains in a way that nobody can describe explicitly and coherently. And there is a world outside experience, which is pure abstraction. It's a world that has no colors, has no scents, has no flavors, because colors, scents, and flavors are experiences created in our brain inside our skull. That's the assumption of materialism. And so the real world of materialism is a world of abstraction describable through quantities. A list of quantities such as mass, charge, momentum, position, amplitude, frequency, weight, and so on and so forth. And if you provide this complete list of numbers, then you've said everything there is to say about matter, about the world outside. Which of course leaves out all qualities, but qualities according to materialism are somehow epiphenomena. They are created by matter inside the brain within our skulls. So the world of our experience from materialism exists entirely within our heads. If you look up to the sky at night and you see a bright star, that star, insofar as it's constituted by color, is actually inside your skull. The inner surface of your skull is beyond the stars as you experience them under materialism. Because the experience of the star is supposed to be conjured up inside your head by your brain. There is a real star beyond your skull, but that's not the star you see. It's the thing that somehow modulates the star you see. So that's the mind twist that you have to do if you are to be consistent with materialism in your thinking. All the images you experience are inside your actual skull. The inner surface of your actual skull is beyond the room you see right now. There is a room beyond your skull, but that's not your experience of it. It's an abstract room describable purely by quantities. It's something you can't even visualize, because if you visualize, you already put qualities in the mix. So that's materialism, and its main problem is that nobody can provide a satisfying account of how quantities can possibly produce qualities. There seems to be a fundamental epistemic chasm between the two. There is nothing about quantities that would allow us to deduce, at least in principle, the qualities of experience. There is nothing about mass, charge, momentum that would allow us to deduce what it is like to see red, what it is like to fall in love, or to have a bellyache. There is a correlation between these two things, but that correlation is not amenable to causation. It's very difficult to coherently specify a chain of causation from quantities to qualities. Now, to me, this means that we have reduced materialism to absurdity. Not that we have a problem to solve, the hard problem of consciousness, how do you come up with qualities starting from quantities, it's not a problem to be solved, it just illustrates the contradictions of our assumptions. For me, what we call matter is not the cause of consciousness, it's what certain mental processes look like from a certain perspective. I think the error we've made is twofold. The first error we made was to conflate images with the thing in itself. We think the world we see is the thing in itself, as opposed to the appearance, the representation, the image of the thing in itself. In other words, it's what the thing in itself looks like when observed from a certain perspective. Matter is appearance. It's what the thing in itself looks like. That's why it sort of vanishes when you study quantum physics down to entanglement. So that was our first error. We conflate, we take the images, the representations, to be the thing in itself. Error number one. Error number two, very related to the first, we try to replace reality with a description of reality. We try to pull the territory out of the map. We start from an experience of the outside world, a world of colors, of sounds, melodies, flavors. And then we describe that with quantities, which is fine, we're creating a map of reality. But then we say the quantities, the map, is primary. It comes before the world of experience. In other words, we replace reality with our description of reality. And that leads, of course, to impossible implications. But then we call it a problem and we promise ourselves we will solve the problem in the future. I mean, it's pathetic. It's quite ironic. I mean, future generations probably will be merciless about us because our errors are so obvious, but they are so enshrined in the culture that we can't see them anymore. I think what's happening is that the thing in itself is mentality. You see that every time you look in the mirror. If you're sad and you're crying and you look into the mirror, you see tears flowing down your face. But you will never think that the tears are the thing in itself. That the tears are the whole story. That the image in the mirror is the whole story. You know.
To say that the tears are not sadness. Sadness.
Exactly. A contorted face with tears in the mirror is not the sadness. It's what the sadness looks like when observed from a certain perspective. It's the appearance, the image, the representation of the sadness. But behind the image, behind the appearance, there is the thing in itself, the sadness. It is a mental event, a mental process.
Let me see if I can make an analogy. Would it be like if you're watching TV or movie or playing a video game and you have a monitor and the actual data is the RGB values, but then what we can see are explosions and faces, and it would be a mistake to think those secondary inferences, those faces and explosions, are fundamental, but the RGB values are the actual fundamental.
That's a fair analogy. We have to be careful because ultimately you're talking about appearances being the images of other appearances, because the computing going on behind the images you see is also material. So from my perspective, it's also an appearance. For me, matter is what mental processes look like from across a dissociative boundary. In other words, from a certain perspective. And that applies to all matter. But as a metaphor or as an analogy, it's valid to go along this line you just proposed.
Okay, across a dissociative boundary. Why don't you explain how dissociative identity disorder gives rise to some of how you view the world?
I can sort of immediately give an example from research. There was research done on the images of other appearances, because the component
are explosions and faces, and it would be a mistake to think those secondary inferences, those faces and explosions, are fundamental, but the RGB values are the actual fundamental.
That's a fair analogy. We have to be careful because ultimately you're talking about appearances being the images of other appearances, because the computing going on behind the images you see is also material. So from my perspective, it's also an appearance. For me, matter is what mental processes look like from across a dissociative boundary. In other words, from a certain perspective. And that applies to all matter. But as a metaphor or as an analogy, it's valid to go along these lines you just proposed.
Okay, across a dissociative boundary. Why don't you explain how dissociative identity disorder gives rise to some of how you view the world?
I can sort of immediately give an example from research. There was research done, I think, at Harvard several years ago. They studied patients with the dissociative identity disorder, which are people who seem to have multiple alter personalities with different memories, different proclivities, different tastes, different ways of being. But they are in fact just dissociated aspects of a single mind, that person's mind. Now, research has shown that when these people dream, different alter personalities can experience the same dream from different perspectives. And they can even see the other alters as other avatars within the same dream. I would say that this is a great metaphor for what might be happening right now, because the biggest argument against this idea that mind is fundamental is that I can't read your thoughts, and presumably you can't read mine. So if mind is fundamental, how come it seems to be so neatly bound by matter, if matter is derivative and mind fundamental? Well, I would suggest that what's happening there is entirely analogous to what's happening in the mind of a patient with dissociative identity disorder. When mental processes become inferentially separate from each other, when they can't evoke one another, when memories become separate, personality traits become separate, we call it dissociation. And that dissociation is bound by a so-called dissociative boundary. We have plenty of empirical evidence for that in psychiatry. And we have proof that this is a real phenomenon since the beginning of neuroimaging 20 years ago. People with DID have particular identifiable, recognizable patterns of brain activity that differ from those that do not have DID. People with DID can even be literally blind by dissociation. If an outer who is blind is in control of the body, mental activity or brain activity in the visual cortex has been shown to disappear, and that's not something you can fake. When you're looking around with your eyes open and there is no activity in your visual cortex, while when another outer comes and takes control of the body, that mental or that brain activity returns and is measurable again.
And when you say alter, you mean one of those personalities?
One of those personalities, yes.
Traditionally, it's called multiple personality disorder or split personality disorder, and you're just referring to one of those.
Correct.
The way that I understand this is that there's mind at large, and then it fractionates itself into smaller consciousnesses that each have their own proclivities and access to memories that others don't, much like multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder. Okay, now what I'm wondering is, would this analogy still work if we didn't refer to that person who has DID as one person? So for example, in your home right now, there's you, there's your cat, maybe there's some other people. And when you enter and leave, I wouldn't say that that's Bernardo's split personalities. I would say he has a home, and these are different people coming in and out. So part of the analogy you make is when we consider that person with multiple personality disorder as a single individual split. But what if we don't think of them as a single individual anymore? We think of them as actually housing different personalities. So then, can you still make that analogy that it's all one mind at large?
Look, the experience of separation definitely exists. I'm having it right now. I can't read your thoughts, I can't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, and I can't influence the thoughts of the presidents of the world's nations. If I could, the world would be looking very different right now. So it exists as an experience in the same way that the different alters of a person with DID experience the same dream from a different perspective. So the experience of separation exists. It would be silly to deny that because it's a basic datum of existence. What I would say is that fundamentally there is no separation. That experience of separation is a form of illusion. Fundamentally, it's all happening in one natural mind. A mind that spans across the universe like the theoretical quantum fields in quantum theory. The same boundlessness is implied there. But you see, if we have a theory of reality that does justice to reason and evidence, I think that theory would unavoidably point to this mental oneness at the most fundamental layer of reality. It wouldn't invalidate our ordinary experience because they exist as such, they exist as experiences, but they could inform our judgment, we could inform even our ethical systems in a much healthier way than what's going on right now. Because if you know, at least from thinking and evidence, from reason and evidence, that most likely we are all authors of one mind, I think we would look at our perceived enemies differently, we would look at underprivileged people in the world differently, we would regard animal life differently, and I think that would be a good step forward.
What's special about life that makes it such that it's its own little dissociative identity, as opposed to, let's say, a computer? And then, wait, sorry, to add to that, you were suggesting before that people get, well, this is in the literature, people get dissociative identity from trauma. So what I was wondering is, okay, so let's say you give birth. What you've done is you've created some acausal chain within those nodes that you had in a PowerPoint slide before. People can't see that right now, but maybe I can overlay that. So every time we give birth, or every time an ant gives birth, is the universe being traumatized in some way, and it's saying, I can't handle this, let me create a new personality?
I don't think so. I think that's an instance of taking the metaphor too far. What makes life special for us is that we are alive. But other than that, life is just one natural phenomenon amongst gazillions of natural phenomena. I would say a quasar is a very, very special natural phenomenon, a very impressive one. So is a black hole. I think what we call life, biology, is what dissociation looks like when observed from across its dissociative boundary. It's the image of the phenomenon. To make an analogy, there was a neuroimaging study of dissociative identity disorder that was carried out in the Netherlands, where I am, in 2014 by Jolanda Schlumpf and collaborators. And they have shown that if you image the activity in the brain of a person with dissociative identity disorder, those dissociative processes have a certain image. They look like something identifiable. You can point at them and say, hey, this is the pattern of brain activity we see when the person is dissociated. So there is something dissociative processes look like in the brain of a person with DID. I would go as far with this analogy as to say, well, when the universe undergoes dissociative identity disorder, or something metaphorically related to dissociative identity disorder, those natural dissociative processes in the universe also look like something. There must be something it looks like. Every phenomenon in nature looks like something when observed from a given perspective. So must dissociation be. It must look like something. And I would offer to you that what it looks like is what we call biology. That life is the image of that dissociation. Now, how the first living organism has arisen, how the mind of nature dissociated for the first time, I don't know. Could we drag the idea of trauma to this boundless natural mind? Maybe. I see something to that, but it's not necessarily the case for the theory to hold. I would just entertain this idea as an interesting extra. But now, beyond that point, beyond those initial associations, maybe one has happened and then died off, and then it happened again in a different way, eventually it didn't die off. From that point on, we can apply the theory of natural evolution verbatim to this. I'm not offering a new science. I'm offering a new interpretation of science from a metaphysical perspective. Evolution still holds. What is maintaining the dissociative processes is that for some reason, at some point, one dissociative process arose that could create another, that could maintain that dissociation. And that it could do that is sufficient to account for why it did, or why it continues to do it. Because that's what evolution by natural selection tells us. If an organism can reproduce more effectively, it will pass on the ability to reproduce more effectively to its descendants. And merely because it's more effective at that, it will predominate and it will continue to exist. And so dissociation has come to 7.5 billion human beings, plus countless gazillions of other living beings on this earth. Because it's the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. The ones that could do it were selected, and we keep on doing it. We keep on perpetuating the dissociation because of evolution by natural selection. Anything else you add to that goes far into speculative territory. I think it's valid speculation. But for the theory that I'm proposing to hold, all you need is evolution by natural selection. You don't need any extra bells and whistles.
You also need that consciousness is primitive, correct?
I would say that consciousness is the primitive. Not personal consciousness, not your consciousness or my consciousness, but the consciousness of nature. I would say that's the primitive, and what matter is what mental processes in that natural mind look like from across a dissociative boundary. Now, I am dissociated. What is my dissociative boundary? Well, it looks like my eyes, my skin, my ears, my tongue, the surface of my body and my sense organs. When my dissociative outer is infringed upon by mental activity that surrounds me, I register that in the form that we call matter. Because again, evolution was such that our sense organs evolved to perceive the states of the world around us in an encoded way. This has been proven mathematically, by the way. We need to encode our sense perceptions in order to resist the second law of thermodynamics, in order not to dissolve into an entropic soup. So we encode information about the outside world in the form of a sort of a dashboard. And what is that dashboard? It's the colors we see, the sounds we hear.
What you mean when you say that if we were to mirror reality exactly as it is, that we would dissolve in an entropic soup, is that Carl Friston?
That's correct.
And are you essentially saying, because I haven't read his work, are you essentially saying in the second law of thermodynamics, if you have two isolated bodies to bring them together, then they're going to...
You don't need to go that far. The idea is mathematically extraordinarily complex. It took me a long time to persuade myself that they were onto something. But the implication for you to understand what the math is saying is very simple. Look, there are practically infinite states in the world out there, right? Infinite bits of information in the world out there. If our perception were to mirror that variety of states in the world out there, there would be too much dispersion within our body, too many states, and we would lose our dynamical and structural integrity. In other words, we would devolve into a boiling soup because it's too much information to absorb, too many dispersed states to mirror within the boundaries of our dissociative process, which Friston calls the Markov blanket. He models our dissociative boundary according to the mathematical model that we call a Markov blanket, which is mathematically very sensible to do. So we can't mirror the states of the world outside, otherwise we would dissolve into a boiling soup. So what can we do to gather as much information as possible about the world outside? Because it's important to do that if we want to survive. We need to know what's going on around us. The way to do that is to encode those states in an inferential manner. You don't mirror them all inside you. You capture what is relevant about them in a kind of internal dashboard of dials. What those dials show is not the world as it is in itself. It's not the thing in itself. What they provide is a representation of that world. Think of it as a pilot, an airplane pilot in bad weather with clouds at night. He can't see the world, but he trusts his instrument panel. So he needs the instrument panel in order to survive the trip, but the instrument panel is not the world, and that's the mistake we make. Our instrument panel has a name, we call it matter, the stuff we perceive around us. And it's important to take it seriously, because otherwise you will run under a truck. Otherwise you die starving because you don't take seriously the fact that there is food in front of you. We should take it seriously, but we have to keep in mind that that instrument panel is not the world. The pilot's instrument panel is not the storm outside, it's not the clouds, it's not the sky, it's not the land underneath. It is a representation of it. And we make this mistake. We take the instrument panel to be the thing in itself. And there it goes terribly wrong, because it leads to impossible contradictory implications, which we can't solve because they are just...
Wait. out of service now, and this crew will be hoping that was time and effort well spent. Have they got the most critical issues under control?
Start.